Freshwater resources. Water is an extremely important commodity. All living things require water, and in fact, your body is about 70% water by weight. As a result, it's important that we understand what water resources we have and have a good understanding of how we use and conserve water. When we look at planet Earth as a whole, one might come to the conclusion that there's plenty of water available. That's a little misleading because of the water available on the planet, about 97% of it is salt water, not particularly useful to humans. That leaves about 2.5% of all the water on Earth as fresh water. But wait, 1.7% of it is held as ice and virtually unavailable for human use. As a result, less than 1% of all the water on the planet is accessible as fresh water. When we talk about water on planet Earth, we need to keep in mind that water is continuously cycling through the environment. This cycling, a natural cycle, is referred to as the hydrologic cycle. If we look at this diagram for a second, we see that water vapor collects in the atmosphere and coalesces as clouds. That water will fall to the surface of the Earth as precipitation. When it collects in areas, it will eventually, by the heat of the sun, be evaporated back into the atmosphere, where it collects again into clouds, falls again as precipitation, snow, sleet, rain, and the cycle continues around and around. Some of the water that falls on landforms will fall on vegetation, be absorbed by the plants, and then through transpiration re-enter the atmosphere. Some of the water that falls on the land will percolate into the soil and become part of the groundwater, and some of the water that falls on landforms will collect in rivers, lakes, and streams. That's still part of the hydrologic cycle because ultimately that water will evaporate back into the atmosphere and once again form clouds, which then precipitate back to Earth's surface. Water on the land masses falls into two categories: surface water and groundwater. Surface water, which occurs in streams, lakes, and ponds, etc., is water that collects from runoff during precipitation. We find that surface water is typically organized into what are called watersheds, which are areas of land that are drained by a single river, sometimes called a drainage basin. Down here you can see the watershed for the Susquehanna River, and I just like to point out that these rivers, these watersheds, do not respect political boundaries. As you can see, they cross state lines, multiple counties in Pennsylvania, etc. That makes it difficult sometimes to deal with watershed problems because they do cross these boundaries so much. The other kind of water that's found on landforms is groundwater, and groundwater is the supply of fresh water that's found under the Earth's surface. When water percolates into the ground, it will settle into areas of porous rock and soil materials that can trap water. In this case, these are referred to as aquifers. An aquifer will naturally discharge by a spring or a lake or a stream so that it re-enters the hydrologic cycle, though that takes long periods of time. That is, once water enters an aquifer, it stays in the aquifer for hundreds of years. But we humans sometimes extract water by drilling a well into these aquifers and pumping the water out. The other thing that I wanted to point out about aquifers is they can be quite large. As you can see here, this particular aquifer covers numerous states in the West and would supply water, groundwater, to all of this region. The other thing that's important to remember about groundwater and aquifers is that they're considered highly vulnerable because, as I said, once this water enters the aquifer, it stays there for long periods of time, measured in hundreds of years. Though it will eventually move and re-enter the hydrologic cycle, it moves very slowly. Therefore, if something were to happen, either we overdraw from this water supply, that is, take more water out than is re-entering by by being recharged, or if we were to pollute this aquifer, it would be damaged or constricted for long periods of time. That's important to keep in mind. Groundwater pollution can almost be considered permanent. We use water in different ways. There's sort of two fundamentally different ways we use water. One way is called a consumptive use, the other is called a non-consumptive use. A consumptive use is a use in which the water is taken from a source and it's not returned to that source. A good example is irrigation and other agricultural pursuits. Here, for instance, water might be taken from a lake or a river, and that water would be placed on a field where it's absorbed by plants. It's taken from the river and not returned to the river or to the other water body. That's a consumptive use. A non-consumptive use is one in which the water is returned to its source, where it can be used over and over again. A good example of that is power generation, or even domestic use, that is household use. In, for instance, a power plant, water might be taken from a river or a lake, used for cooling in the power plant, and then that water is returned to that water body. It's being used over and over again. That's a non-consumptive use. One thing that you do have to keep in mind, though, is even a non-consumptive use could devalue the water supply because the water could be contaminated or polluted during its use. But if it's put back where it came from, it's considered a non-consumptive use. If we look at water uses worldwide, we see that generally speaking, the most important use of water worldwide is through agriculture. Irrigation is the predominant use. Here we see this graph showing different divisions, that is different continents, and here the worldwide summary. Clearly worldwide, and in lesser developed nations or developing nations, the number one use is certainly going to be agriculture. We do see here that industrial uses of water do eclipse agricultural uses in highly industrialized nations, but worldwide the number one use is agriculture. So I want you to keep in mind from this presentation that water is extremely valuable and it's a resource that we must use wisely.